I've spent the last 15 years experimenting with wild foods, and here's the thing. Some wild foods just taste weird, and even if you can soldier through it with your experimental tastes, your family may not be able to. I hear a lot of people talking about wild greens that are either too fibrous, too pokey, too hairy, or too sour. Cleavers, which a lot of people think is edible, has literal barbs on it. Plantain, you can basically floss your teeth with it. I have tried that, by the way, do not recommend. Purple dead nettle literally tastes like eating velvet, and not in a good way. So which wild greens are actually good? That's what we're talking about in this video. The 10 plants we're talking about in this video are plants that I have extensively eaten and served to others, and so I can vouch for their tastiness. I have these plants ranked in order of how much I love them, and the very last plant is going to be the one that I love the very most, and I can't wait to share that one with you. You should know that most of these plants are actually weeds, and you might even be able to find them in your very own yard. A little reminder for those enthusiastic foragers out there, remember that you always should be 100% confident about what the plant is before you put it in your mouth. I can't tell you how many times people have asked me what a plant is after they put it in their mouth. Do not do this, please. Use your resources and get confident. Let's get started. In 10th place, I have dandelion. Let's take a moment to look at identifying dandelion. It's actually called dandelion because dent de lion in French means tooth of the lion. So you may notice that the leaves have teeth-like edges, and the edges of the leaves of dandelion can vary quite a bit. I will also say that the leaves of dandelion don't have hair, and we'll talk about hairy cat's ear in a little bit. The flowers of dandelion also have one flower on a single flower stalk, which is important when we're differentiating it from others. So everyone loves to talk about how much they love dandelion. It's edible, you can put it in salads. People even say like it cures all these diseases. However, if you've tasted it, it's like pretty bitter. And I do like it, but I want to talk about when to harvest dandelion and how to harvest the leaves so that they're a little less bitter. And there's also a little bit of a processing thing we can do to make the leaves less bitter. We really want to harvest dandelion before it flowers, which is going to be in the springtime. And sometimes because this green comes up so early, it can be earlier than we even expect to be able to be harvesting greens. If it's a really like unseasonably warm winter, it could even be coming up in February. So that really early springtime is when we're going to harvest the leaves of dandelion. They're much less bitter that time of year. And if we harvest specifically the new tender growth, those are going to be the least bitter of the least bitter. So that's number one. Number two, we want to actually boil dandelion greens before eating them and discard the water. This is a common practice in a lot of wild edibles where you're basically removing the bitter compounds, and in some cases those bitter compounds are toxic. We're removing it in the water, and then we're discarding the water and eating the greens. So you're going to boil it for anywhere from 1 to 5 minutes in a simmering, bubbling pot of water. And you're going to take the leaves out, strain them, and you can even wring the water out and then cook them from there. I will say that some people like the bitterness of dandelion greens, in which case go for it. Just know that any plant that has a really intense bitter taste and other tastes like acrid can be overdone. So you don't want to eat too much of that flavor. One time I was eating dandelion leaves and it was like kind of later in the season. They were really bitter. This was a time in my life when I was like okay with eating things that tasted terrible. And I actually ended up all the joints in my body hurt at once suddenly. And that was just a case of like, it was too late in the season. I ate too much of it. It was raw and my body didn't like it. So this can definitely happen with certain plants that have a lot of wild compounds in them because wild plants are not from the grocery store and they have not been tampered with by humans. And so they actually end up having a lot more compounds in them than non-wild plants. All right, coming in 9th place, we have wild fennel. We are seeing yellow flowers in an umbel shape flower cluster or inflorescence. And it's kind of like an upside down umbrella basically. And we're going to see this in carrot family plants. We'll talk about that in a second. And we're also looking at these wire-like leaves that look really fuzzy in the springtime and actually kind of feel really fuzzy, and they can be tender early in the spring. Fennel as a whole has a little bit of a blue-green sheen, the entire plant, which is a little bit different than other carrot family plants as well. Fennel is a member of the carrot family alongside wild carrot and then some of the poisonous plants like poison hemlock and water hemlock. Luckily, fennel has filamentous leaves, which means that they are round like a wire and not flattened like most other carrot family plants. It also has yellow flowers, which differentiates it from a lot of the white flowers of the poisonous plants in this family. So it is fairly easy to tell apart, but just know that this family in general is something that you need to take extra care with when you're identifying it, so as you're not harvesting something poisonous rather than the edible food that you're looking for. I do love this plant. It has a very unique, sweet, licoricey taste, but I like it in smaller doses, so maybe a little bit in some salads, a little bit in some soups here and there, but it does have a very strong specific taste, so I'm not going to be eating like large amounts of this plant. I also will say that wild fennel has amazingly aromatic seeds. The fennel seeds that you buy at the grocery store are nothing in comparison to harvesting this plant in the wild. I like to harvest these seeds, pull them off of the seed stalks, and put them in sausage, put them in soups, and even just make tea out of them. This is my favorite part of the plant, and actually I harvest it a lot more than just the leaves. All right, in 8th place, we have dwarf mallow, Malva neglecta. This grows really commonly where I am, but it's possible that another mallow species might grow where you live, so you'll need to look it up. To ID dwarf mallow, we're going to take a look at the leaves, which are palmate leaves that have a bunch of different veins that converge in the center of the leaf. And the flowers, it's actually related to hibiscus, so the flowers have an interesting thing in the middle that looks a lot like hibiscus. But they're 5 petals and they have this little notch in them, and they're just a little bit pink, but mostly white. And they also have these really interesting seeds that kind of look like buttons that apparently are quite slimy when you use them. And then the whole plant kind of has this creeping, viney, along the ground habit. Now, the leaves of mallow are a little bit mucilaginous, which is like okra or flax seeds or chia seeds. It has that sliminess to it. So this is not something that I like to eat raw, just because the texture gets a little strange the longer you chew. It kind of gets more and more slimy and squidgy and weird in your mouth. So I don't recommend serving your guests an entire salad worth of dwarf mallow leaves. Cooking them definitely reduces the mucilaginous quality, but the best way to deal with this type of green in that setting is actually just to dilute it with other wild greens. So I typically combine dwarf mallow with some of the other greens on this list in things like ripassata, which is boiled and then sauteed greens. And those are things that kind of just, any intense green, it can kind of reduce the weirdness of it by diluting it with other weird things. It's kind of a weird concept, but it works. One thing that I will say about dwarf mallow is that there are a few lookalikes, one of which is shiny geranium and some of the other geranium species. And if we look at the leaves here, we'll notice that the lobes of shiny geranium cut way farther down into the center than the dwarf mallow leaves. And the flowers are actually super different too. Shiny geranium flowers are bright fuchsia, like a lot of other geranium flowers, and dwarf mallow flowers, we've already looked at them, they're white. So once it starts flowering, it would be pretty hard to mix these ones up. Again, with this plant, I am always harvesting new and tender leaves. You can harvest the older ones and just boil them a little bit more, but the new tender leaves are going to be the most choice. In 7th place, we have bittercress, which is actually one of the few wild greens that are available in the wintertime. And this is available in the wintertime in places that don't have deep, deep frosts the entire winter. So where I live in the Pacific Northwest, especially in the temperate regions, it just grows in your garden, and sometimes it's the only green thing out there in the wintertime, and thankfully it is edible. Bittercress is related to mustard. It's in the Brassica family, and so it is a little bit spicy. So for those of you who like arugula or mustard greens, you're gonna love bittercress. Little pro tip with bittercress: when you harvest it, you can harvest the whole plant. Just make sure you look inside the plant for tiny little bugs that like to hide in the crown. And then also the center part where all the leaves meet of this plant can be quite fibrous, so I like to cut that part out when I'm processing it for cooking. There are actually a lot of different species of bittercress, so you'll need to do a little bit of research about which ones grow near you. All right, here is another controversial choice. My 6th place one, which is not my 1st place one, interestingly, is nettle. I do love nettle, but there are things that I love more than nettle. And if you're new to foraging, yes, I am talking about stinging nettle, the one that stings you when you touch it. So we'll need to talk a little bit about that as well. This wild edible is actually one of the more popular greens. partially because it is super nutritious. Like if they remade the Popeye show, it would actually be, instead of spinach, it would be nettle, because nettle is actually even more nutritious than spinach, and it doesn't have oxalic acid in it, which is nice. It's actually got more protein than any of the other greens on this list, and it's really high in iron, calcium, and other minerals. So definitely worth your time as far as harvesting this plant in the wild and feeding it to your family. So unlike a lot of the other plants on this list, this plant is not a weed. It is native to where I live in the Pacific Northwest. It likes growing in the forest. It especially likes like really leaf duff rich soil with a little bit of sunlight. So look in like stream beds and open fields in the forest, like with some openings in the trees because it needs a little bit of sunlight. But it can also grow in like compost piles, and sometimes you'll find it even just like under in a big field, like near a big leaf maple tree. That's one of my favorite patches, is in that scenario. But whatever it is, it's probably going to be something soft and rich because it spreads by rhizome, and those rhizomes need space underneath the soil to spread. So this is actually something that you can grow in your garden, and that is actually how you produce an environment that nettle likes. A lot of people grow this plant in a pot so that it doesn't take over the garden and create a stinging plant everywhere, but I personally would just put it in a corner and I'd be pretty happy with as much nettle as I could get. So let's talk about the stings of nettle. The stings aren't actually harmful long term. They do get a little like painful, and then they get itchy after like the second day or so. So it's not ideal to get stung. So of course, when you harvest it, you're going to be wearing gloves. I recommend wearing gloves that don't have that mesh on top of it because they can sting you through the mesh. So I wear leather gloves or gloves like wintertime gloves that they're rubberized, including on the tops as well. You can actually see the stinging hairs on nettle, which does help us a little bit with the ID. They look like little syringes, and they're like clear and glass looking. You have to look a little bit close. There's a lot of them on the stems and the backs of the leaves, especially when they're just sprouting up. There are some other lookalikes, so let's point out a few other identifying characteristics. We're also going to look for these bracts that are located at the base of the leaf stem, where the leaf stem meets the main stem. And there's 2 bracts per stem, and the leaves are opposite, so we're going to look for 4 bracts per node of nettle. And then of course, if you're ever in doubt, you can always just sting yourself to see if it works. If it doesn't sting you, it's probably not nettle. It might be hedge nettle or something like that. Something that you should know about nettle is that you should not harvest nettle after it begins to flower. This is what the flowers look like, and this is because it starts to develop a compound called cystoliths. And cystoliths, lith actually means stone, and these are kind of sharp compounds that can be irritating to the kidneys and are especially not good for people with kidney stones. So once nettle has flowered, we're going to stop harvesting it for the season, but there actually is a short period in the fall where nettle resprouts, sometimes from the old nodes from the previous growth, and we can harvest that again, and it doesn't usually come to flower again. So they look like spring shoots, they're going to be flowerless, and they can be pretty good in the fall as a second harvest. Now, because nettle does sting, I think some people feel a little bit intimidated by this plant. We just need to make sure that we wear gloves while we're harvesting it. We put it in a bag that's not going to be like with other things we're reaching in with our bare hands. So make sure you just stay out of that bag with your bare hands. You're going to bring it home. You're going to wear gloves while you're taking it back out of the bag to cook. You can use tongs. And basically, you're just going to parboil it. So you take your tongs and your gloves, you're pulling the nettle leaves out, you're putting it in this big pot of boiling water. You're going to leave it in there for 1 minute, and you're going to take it back out and strain it. And then you can use that parboiled nettle in whatever dish that you're making. And nettle can actually be substituted, or it can substitute spinach in a lot of dishes. So things like the Indian dish saag, S-A-A-G, you can put it in there, and you can also like make spanakopita with nettle. You can put nettle in quiches and frittatas, and it's really, really good. So just do that parboiling step, or you can literally just saute it in a pan if you want after chopping the raw nettle, and that will get rid of the stings as well. All right, now we're getting into the really good stuff. We're getting to the top 5. So in 5th place, we have lamb's quarters. The leaves of lamb's ears are pretty unique. They have these kind of arrowhead shaped leaves with these irregular lobes on the edges. And then the undersides of the leaves look a little bit silver because they have this kind of like silver dust on the underside that isn't on the top of the leaf. And the little kind of fronds or shoots of lamb's ears do have opposite leaves. They kind of are similar to nettle, I guess. And when they're young, they're quite floppy. Lamb's quarters is actually a lot like spinach. It does not sting you, which is nice, and it actually is more nutritious than spinach in a lot of different categories as well. So lamb's quarters grows on a lot of farms. It loves disturbed, rich soil. So sometimes I'll find it in public gardens, sometimes I'll find it on farmland, growing kind of in the farm, like between the rows at the farm. And you want to harvest this plant also before it flowers because the stems get really fibrous. You could harvest the individual leaves later in the season, but it's really better to get kind of the spring shoots because then you can eat the whole plant, including the stem. It's all very tender, and that's when it's really best. This is another plant that is really good to parboil before eating. And the reason for that is that it does contain some level of oxalates, though I have to say that spinach also contains oxalates. And in fact, according to some sources that I saw, spinach contains more oxalates than lamb's quarters. So people will tell you that you can eat lamb's quarters raw, but personally, because I'm a little bit sensitive to oxalates, I always pre-cook lamb's quarters before I eat it. And again, with the nettles, we're gonna just plunge it in boiling water for 1 minute and then strain it and discard the water. Something that I wanna say about parboiling plants is that if the plant is a little bit fibrous, like I'm not talking about that in this video, but sow thistle is a pretty good wild edible as well. And that plant can get a little bit fibrous. Just boil it for longer. You can boil things for up to 20 minutes and you can really soften a lot of more fibrous tissue that maybe you're harvesting later in the season. Just know that this boiling process isn't going to help that woodiness that comes, it kind of turns white in the middle of the stem. Nothing's going to break that down, okay? So be reasonable about your expectations for parboiling in general. In fourth place, we have purslane. Purslane has little yellow flowers and succulent green leaves that are pretty thick, and it has kind of a sprawling habit that creeps along the ground. It also has these little green seed pods that are full of tiny black seeds. This is a green that I wish grew a lot more where we live. Unfortunately, it does not. I know it grows more in California. It likes sidewalk cracks, strangely, and like cracks in the patio and cracks between bricks in walkways. A lot of it grows where it gets stepped on a lot, which is unfortunate, but when it grows in the right spot, sometimes it'll volunteer in your garden bed if you're lucky. You could also plant seeds if you wanted. This green is succulent. And so it does like to have a little bit of water in order to be like really nice and juicy. But this is one of my favorites just because the texture is so unique. It's a little bit tart, it's very watery, it's crunchy, and you can eat it raw and cooked, and you can actually pickle it. I went to Turkey several years ago and had pickled purslane as part of kind of like a meze platter, and it was absolutely amazing. Purslane is one of the few succulent plants that grows in my area, though I'm aware that some of you watching this video may have more succulent plants growing where you are, especially those that live in the warmer areas in the US. So careful of your ID. One plant that grows right next to plantain where I live is actually this spurge plant, and they look kind of similar, but purslane is succulent and spurge is not. So I would say that that look-alike situation for purslane is like once you take a closer look, it's fairly easy to ID. As with other plants, it is best to harvest purslane before it flowers just because the stems aren't woody yet and usually they're nice and tender. However, if you do harvest it later in the season, you're just going to need to take the leaves off and not eat the stems, and that's fine. Overall, I definitely recommend eating purslane in salads. I don't recommend eating like the whole salad as purslane because purslane is a little bit mucilaginous. So if you like have too much of it, you're going to start like forming these big globby things in your mouth, and you don't necessarily want that. So I recommend accenting a salad with purslane. You can also like put some on a sandwich or, add some as a garnish on a plate. So like in smaller amounts, I would say purslane is so fantastic. Pickling does reduce the mucilaginousness of it a little bit. So you could try that if you're struggling with the mucilage. In third place, we have miner's lettuce, and there are a couple different species of miner's lettuce that I'm talking about here. I am not talking about Siberian miner's lettuce, which makes me feel funky and tastes really funky too. It grows a lot where I live. We are talking about common miner's lettuce and red miner's lettuce, and there may even be other species that grow in other places in the US that I don't know about. Feel free to educate us in the comments. But this green can be eaten raw and cooked, and it's really fantastic. You can eat quite a bit of it. It's fairly easy to ID because of the shape of the leaves. They're like little cups with the flower coming out of the center. And then the basil leaves actually are kind of little like spade heart shaped, which are fairly easy to ID as well. It also has this like rosette shape to it that's like very fractal and very symmetrical, and kind of easy to notice as it's coming up in the spring. So the house that we moved into recently actually has miner's lettuce all over the yard in the springtime. And so we ate a ton of this year. And I didn't used to like cooking miner's lettuce, but this year I discovered that you just don't want to cook it too much. I thought it would be like slimy like lettuce, but if you cook it a little bit, it's actually an amazing cooked green. And since we had so much of it, I was putting it in like blended soups and like pasta dishes and all of these things. And it just has such like a mild, slightly nutty flavor that it was really good like background vegetable for most dishes. Here we have another controversial choice. This is a lesser known wild edible. I don't hear a lot of people talking about it. This is something that I discovered later in my wild edible career, having kind of put it off because it's hairy and it looks like dandelion, so I thought it'd be bitter, but it's neither of those things when you cook it right. And so in second place, we have hairy cat's ear. So to start off, yes, this plant looks a lot like dandelion. Dandelion leaves don't have hair on them, and these leaves do. They also have slightly rounder lobes on the edges than dandelion, so that's how you're gonna tell it apart. Also, hairy cat's ear has branched flower stems, and dandelion just has one flower per stem. It is much less bitter than dandelion, which for me is a big selling point. It is also actually even more common where I live than dandelion. It grows all over my lawn, more than dandelion by a long shot, and it loves lawns in general. So if you're going to be looking for this plant, look in your lawn first. And if it's not in your lawn, you can try neighbors' lawns. Sometimes it grows in like I've got one growing in the rock area in my yard out there that looks extremely healthy. So this plant is not picky. It's definitely a really common weed. It grows all over the United States, and it generally produces some pretty good leaves. And even in the fall, there's kind of like a second time when it produces these really nice tender leaves. And so it can be harvested in the fall as well. Same with dandelion. For the leaves, we're gonna wanna harvest them in the springtime before it flowers generally, but you can actually also eat the flowering stalks as they come up, almost like asparagus. So you don't wanna wait too much because they get bitter, but as the flower stalk just emerges, when it's about maybe the height of your fist, that's when you're gonna snap off the top of it and eat those tiny little flower stalks as well. All right, number one is my all-time favorite green, and I have been known to spot patches of this plant from at least 300 yards away because I have such a nose for it, and this plant is chickweed. I have literally transported bundles of this plant in my purse because I did not have a bag at the time. The stalks are so tender, you can literally just harvest it by pulling it up. And the stalks will just naturally break. One great way of identifying chickweed is by tugging the stems apart so that the outside breaks, and you'll find a tendon inside the sheath. You will also notice that chickweed has a single line of hairs, kind of like a little mohawk along the stem. So I don't cook chickweed. Some people do, that's fine. I think it's better raw. It has this really nice, gentle, nutty flavor that's kind of watery and like really nourishing almost. I don't know how that's a flavor, but it is. And it's really good in salads, but I also make pestos and green sauces, and you could put it in a soup and just cook it a little bit at the end. Green smoothies, a lot of people do their green smoothies, and you can really shove the chickweed in there. Like other wild edibles that we've talked about in this video, the stems do get fibrous as the season progresses, though sometimes this plant, if there's cooler, wetter weather, it will put up new shoots that are tender again, no matter what season it is. So this is a plant that you can harvest in the early spring. There are times in the winter that you can harvest it sometimes. I just saw some sprouting up. It's September, and I just started seeing them like sprouting up in the lawn. I've harvested this for Thanksgiving in November because it was kind of mild and rainy and cold. This plant can survive some frosts, so this is kind of like a shoulder season into the winter harvest, which is really great because a lot of the other stuff either you harvest in later spring or just early spring and not at all the winter. You should also know that chickweed, like a lot of the other plants in this video, does have medicinal uses, which we'll get into in another video. So I want to know in the comments, which are your favorite wild greens? Which wild greens do you think people just shouldn't eat because they're gross? And which ones are you harvesting right now? These are all plants that I'm going to be talking about in my book, Edible Plants of the Pacific Northwest, published by Mountaineers Books. And it's coming out in July 2025, so take a look at that. I will post when it's ready for pre-order. And one of the reasons why I made this video is because I discovered that I didn't like a lot of the edible greens that one should put in a book, so I actually just cut those ones out. And that's kind of like what I did in this video. I really just want to talk about the greens that I would actually recommend going to harvest. My name is Natalie, and I make videos about wild edibles, foraging, herbal medicine, and plants in general. Subscribe if you'd like to keep learning with me.